Hi, everyone. My name is Dhruv Khullar. I'm a physician at Weill Cornell and a contributing writer at The New Yorker. On behalf of the magazine, I would like to welcome everyone to the 25th Annual New Yorker Festival. Thank you for joining our discussion today. I'm here with the incredibly talented, always enlightening Atul Gawande. Before we begin, a quick reminder to please silence your cell phones and refrain from any flash photography. If you're inclined to post on social media, the festival hashtag is NewYorkerFest. We'll have about 60 minutes together today, including time at the end for a few questions from the audience. So you can submit your questions at any time during the event by texting FESTIVAL to the number on the screen behind me, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the show. This event would not be possible without New Yorker subscribers. For those of you who don't yet have a subscription, please consider signing up at newyorker.com. So without further ado, please help me in joining our guest, or welcoming our guest, rather, Atul Gawande. Atul Gawande is the Assistant Administrator for Global Health at the U.S. Agency for International Development, where he oversees its foreign assistance to advance public health around the world. Previously, Dr. Gawande was a practicing surgeon, a Harvard professor, and co-founder of Ariadne Labs, a joint center for health system innovation, and Lifebox, a nonprofit devoted to improving surgical safety. He was a staff writer at The New Yorker from 1999 to 2022, and he has written 4 New York Times bestsellers. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that he's been a tremendous inspiration to me personally and to many physicians around the country. And he's been kind enough to offer guidance and counsel over the years, including when I emailed him as a wee medical student many years ago. So Atul, thank you for being here today. You have engaged in so many different endeavors over the course of your career. You're a surgeon, writer, researcher, CEO. Maybe you could just start by telling the audience kind of what you're doing right now, why you decided to make this transition to the federal government.
First of all, it's awesome to be up here with you, Dhruv, and I'm so glad that you now occupy the Indian American doctor seat at The New Yorker. I have followed my nose, and it's taken me to really odd connections along the way, but I think the theme that I've been fascinated by is why we've had all these incredible discoveries in health and in healthcare and in public health, and I've wondered, why do we fail at getting it to people? As physicians, as clinicians of all kinds, and as a society. And during COVID, I got to join the Biden Advisory Committee on COVID-19 during the transition after the election. And that led to being asked by Samantha Power to join the U.S. Agency for International Development to lead the international side of our COVID response. And that was an opportunity I just couldn't say no to. I didn't know much about USAID. It is, we are the largest contributor of foreign assistance in the world. USAID is our non-military operational capacity for assisting around the world. Our biggest bureau, the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, is our disaster response, and the Health Bureau is the second largest. So I have 2,500 people around the world in the health sector in 65 countries. We deploy about $10 billion a year. Our biggest area has been around ending HIV/AIDS, also TB, polio, malaria, and then it's maternal and child health, but it's also keeping health systems going. And so the great surprise to me about this role was not only was I working on what I felt to be the biggest driver of premature mortality at that time, which was the pandemic, but also getting to think about and then help try to drive what helps us live the longest around the world, learn from a lot of the countries where we work, but also try to drive at scale, improving the kind of care that I felt I got to provide and practice in Boston.
So That's really helpful. And a lot of your work, obviously, has been domestically initially, and now a lot of it is focused overseas. So when you think about kind of the project of expanding longevity in the developed world versus the developing world, I think people probably have an intuition that a lot of more in the developing world is focused on infectious disease versus chronic disease. But of course, chronic diseases like stroke and cardiovascular disease are now leading causes of death in the developing world as well. And so are these basically the same project, or are there key differences when you're trying to expand longevity in poor or middle-income countries versus a place like the United States?
Yeah, you said at the beginning I've focused on domestic and then went to international. And in fact, I've never made that distinction at all. I've been fascinated by the notion that, in the 20th century, we went from, in the year 1900, the average American lived only into your mid-40s. We didn't understand most of the conditions that the human body could have, let alone know how to address it, like hypertension. We didn't know we had high blood pressure. We didn't know that it mattered. We didn't know it's the biggest killer in the world right now. And we certainly didn't have the tools to take care of it. And I've been fascinated by the fact that we now have doubled the human life span, the only species to have done that for itself over the last century, that we actually have the capability to have tripled it to a 90-year life expectancy. But what it takes is so we now know there are 70,000 different conditions that the human body can be afflicted with. For them, we've developed 19,000 FDA-approved drugs. We have 4,000 medical and surgical procedures and hundreds of public health solutions. And our job now in health is to deploy that capability town by town to everybody alive. And it's the most ambitious thing human beings have ever attempted. And so being able to latch on to following my nose on how do we do that? How does any society afford this capability? Where are we able to, how do we make it work? Me as an individual clinician, how am I supposed to manage all of that stuff out there? And then how does my hospital manage to deliver it? And then how does my state or my country or this world? I've been just so enthralled by getting to be part of trying to contribute as a clinician, as an organizational leader, or as a public health official. And it feels endlessly fascinating and interestingly challenging the whole way.
So when you think about, this session is essentially about longevity, and maybe it'd be helpful just to define what we're talking about. When we think about longevity, is it just how long do people live? Is it how long people get to live the type of life that they want to live? People have probably heard about the concept of health span, which is years of life without disability or disease. So which one of these conceptions do you think is most helpful? What are you really trying to promote when you're going about doing your work?
So I've tended to, let me say, it clearly is about more than just surviving. On the other hand, lifespan is people who, so let me put it this way. If our goal is, I see the goal as how do we live longer? It's a fairly simple goal. And of course it's how do we live well as well. But it's really hard to live longer if you also don't have a quality of life. And in general, we've not only extended lifespan, we've significantly extended healthy lifespan, and the two are pretty much in lockstep. There are a few places where we have work that can be separated, like in mental health, but even mental health is an important correlate of life expectancy. So at USAID, one of the things, so I get to have this experiment where we've been working with scores of countries that are largely low-income countries as they climb the ladder to middle income, to upper income, and seen countries that have really followed that stretch, and some of them have gotten to higher life expectancy than the United States. And seeing how they did that and what they did, how you live longer has been, I'd say it boils down to three things. Here's your takeaway. Option number one, get rich. The top 1% of income in the world lives on average 90 years, has a 90-year life expectancy, which means we have the know-how to help people live that long if you have access to the healthcare capabilities and public health capabilities available across your life. Now, if you don't have that option, option number 2 is have a doctor in your family. There's a great study that I love by a Stanford economist who realized that, so in Sweden, you get into medical school by lottery. It was only about 20 years or so, but if you scored above a certain level on your entrance exams, above that, there was a lot more people than they had seats, so they decided to give that by lottery for a good couple decades. And so that's a randomized experiment of going to medical school. And the fascinating thing is, compared to the controls who didn't go in, their family members had a 10% greater likelihood of living past the age of 80. So, and it was dose dependent. If you were a cousin, you got a benefit, but it wasn't quite as big. And nurses also, if you had a nurse in the family, also generated a match that similar level. They didn't randomize that group, so they had to do other controls. But the fascinating thing is that having someone in your family gave you someone to navigate. So they couldn't do the cause effect, but the striking thing to me was that the things they observed were consistent in the idea that you got somebody in your life who could make sure that if you had a problem, you were connected to the health system, that if you were on medicines, you were taking your medicines potentially, or if a pandemic happened, that you would trust and get the vaccine and do other steps along the way, and it saves lives. Now, for the rest of us who can't get rich or have a doctor in your family or a nurse, then I think the thing you can do is have a strong primary healthcare relationship. Far and away, that is the place that you have access to the most critical elements of what keep you living longer. That might be controlling your blood pressure. As a child, it might be getting your vaccinations, getting in for if you have a pneumonia or a diarrheal illness. In a low-income world, it might be getting attention to malaria. It might be around a safe pregnancy when you're in your young adulthood. It might be about recognizing that you have incipient diabetes and getting that under control. At every part of your life course, having a journey with you. So the answer isn't like the latest, greatest breakthrough. It is that we have the knowledge, it's just most people don't get it, or they do get it and it's too late, it's not in a timely way, or there's no consistent reinforcement over time. And the places that we saw, like Costa Rica, now has an 82-year life expectancy, US has a 78-year life expectancy, and they have a fraction of our income. And I got to write about it in the New Yorker article before I started in this job, recognizing the impact that having a system where you had easily accessible primary health care and a community health outreach component of it that knocks on doors in a community to make sure people aren't missed for the care that they need.
So I want to talk a little bit about beyond what that was really helpful in terms of understanding the importance of that relationship or that connection with the healthcare system. But in terms of personal behaviors.
And you're an internist.
I'm an internist, yes, exactly.
But you said you don't have these.
No.
You're in the hospital.
I'm in the hospital, so I just push them back out, and they come back when they're sick. I'm curious as to, it's so helpful and simplifying to figure out what people can actually do and take control of in their own lives. And sometimes I think about big longevity as a industry, and it's now something like a $100 billion industry. And you can sign up for these clinics if you want for $100,000, $150,000 a year, and they'll teach you how to live forever. And my question is, do we basically know 90% of what we need to know? To your point, I mean, if you exercise, you eat well, you sleep enough, don't drink too much, don't smoke at all, and stay connected with friends and family. If you do those 5 or 6 things, are you 95% of the way there? Like, how is it that people are able to sell you a $100,000 product based on that?
So many questions wrapped up in that one. So yes, you just gave the formula. It is 100% true.
All right,
That
this is over. It's over, you guys.
90% is that each stage of your life, we know the big killers. You know, I said at USAID, we said, let's have one metric of what we're all optimizing for. There's the HIV program, the TB program, the outbreak response team, all of those things. And it said, our goal is, number one, reduce to as low as possible death before 50. So we would track now the percentage of deaths in a country that occur before the age of 50. And you know, Africa, it's 60% of deaths are before the age of 50 in the continent. Now it's variable. Some places as low as 30%, others are 75%. In the United States, we're at 10%. So that indicates some degree of how far we can go. But Europe is 5%. Japan is 2%, death before the age of 50. And that, you know, understanding what the elements are, and it is different in different communities, right? In certain communities, your biggest risk may be guns and car crashes. In another setting where, you know, like New York, the cars can't go going fast enough to kill you, and actually gun violence is extremely low, it'll be a different, you know, set of issues. It might be drugs, it might be other things. So, you know, at each stage of life, there are a handful of things that can be the key factors, and then you want easy access to support along the way to address those capabilities.
So in 2014, like any good medical trainee, I pre-ordered your book, Being Mortal, and I read it in basically one sitting. And that book is about confronting the limits of medicine. It's about asking the question of what we should do when medicine can't save you. And I'm curious, you know, it feels like over the past decade there's been a shift in the cultural zeitgeist. And now everything I hear, maybe this is a bias of my own reporting, or maybe it's this AI techno-optimist moment we're in, but it's not, you know, being mortal, it's how not to be mortal. How do we live forever?
Being immortal.
Yes, exactly. And so, first of all, do you buy that there's been a shift over the past decade in the public discourse around some of these issues? And if so, you know, what's behind that shift?
So I'd say there's two things. Number one is there's always been the immortality business, right? The fountain of youth, and like you go back, that of course people would like to potentially live forever, or just at least a really long time, but want to live well. And that industry is just going to be there, and it's going to have new permutations that we will always take on. But I think also what has changed, and I think it's been really interesting in the last decade, is seeing that people are recognizing the goal is not just survival, that the goal is being able to live your priorities, and I call it also I describe it as your loyalties. There are certain things we're willing to risk our lives for. Some of them are just simple joy, you know, the joy of a chocolate cake. Other things, and we take a tiny risk every day for the sake of those things. And part of our job in medicine is to argue that your first order desire, open that refrigerator, have that cake, that we might want to put it off for the sake of your second order desires, the things you want to do that are your loyalties. It might be loyalties to your family and your children. It might be to a great project that you have, or your country, or an ideal. And both of those really matter in people's lives. I think we're getting better now in medicine in the last decade about being able to recognize people have priorities in their lives besides just living longer. Our job is to serve and ensure that what we're doing is enabling those priorities and not just a longer life. And in order to do that, our critical step is we have to ask people what those goals and priorities are. What are you willing to sacrifice and not willing to sacrifice for the sake of more time? What's the minimum quality of life you'd find acceptable? And in Being Mortal, I got to talk about a person who said, if I can eat chocolate ice cream and watch football on television, that would be good enough for me. It's the best living will ever. If he can't, and he said, if I can't do those things, then let me go. But if you can help me do those things, then keep me going. Now, chocolate ice cream, football, and television isn't what I think is life worth living. And each of you have a different story, and that story will change over time, and we have to ask what that capability, what that is. We still only ask in medicine, or your family members, about 25% of the time. So the other 75% suffers for that, because that means that we're often in serious illness giving you treatments that sacrifice things you really care about. And that leads to not just suffering, but pain, conflict with family members, and so on. Public health, I felt in COVID, we did not recognize this lesson. The country was being asked to make trade-offs, the world was, between my child going to school, my being locked up at home and going crazy, and survival. And some of it was survival of those people versus my family, which also is a painful thing. And I don't think we did as good a job as we should have in public health to recognize that, like in medicine, our job is to ask communities, what are your priorities, and to serve those priorities and help people understand there are trade-offs to be made, and that it isn't a crime to not only exclusively prioritize survival. And we have to, that's the job of the political side, is to say, here are the trade-offs. Our job is to sometimes argue with those, let's make sure we're valuing the things we want for the long run. But ultimately, the choices are going to be made community by community, and we still have to incorporate that thinking into our public health world.
That the comment about chocolate ice cream made me remember something I heard a while ago, which was, if you exercise every single day and you never drink any alcohol and you don't eat anything unhealthy, you can live to 100, or at least you feel like you will have. So there's this tension between a quality of life, a life well lived, and just the pure length of life as you're
a friend of mine texted me right before this, like, are you just going to lecture to us on how we can't eat any food and can't have any alcohol? And I said, no.
So as far as we know, Jeanne Calment, a French woman, is the longest lived person in history. She lived to 122. She died in 1997. And so I want you to tell us in what year someone is going to break her record. And I guess the broader question around that is, we talk a lot about average lifespan and improving average lifespan. Is there a world in the coming decades where we improve maximum lifespan? If we're at the 50th New Yorker Festival as opposed to the 25th, are there going to be people in the audience who are 120, 130, 140, or is that not something you foresee in the near future?
So we have not really budged maximum lifespan hardly at all. It's not clear that we've seen people over the decades who've made it to 120, and we haven't been tracking birth certificates, that long. But for the most part, it's been somewhere around, the oldest person had been 118, 120, 122. I think just a week ago, the current oldest person in the world was 118 a few weeks ago. And what we're getting better at is getting people long, high-quality life for longer, getting up to that span. And that is I fully believe we're capable of science to understand how to improve maximum lifespan. And, there's all kinds of interesting things about, the way we're able to regenerate. We have animals as well as, a fetus is able to regenerate organs and capabilities, and dreams of stem cells rejuvenating our own structures and bodies. And so I can't predict what year it will happen, so I don't think it's impossible. I think we can push life expectancy. But if I really had to put a bet, I would put the bet down right now that 25 years from now, we will not have made much of a budge in the 120 or so maximum life expectancy. I'm excited to immediately, upon getting that possibility, figuring out how do we bring that to everybody, because it'll undoubtedly cost, like, someone will charge $2 million for it, and then you got to figure out how to pay for it, and of course only rich will get it. So all of those questions are the ones that totally fascinate me. But I once got to do my favorite interview. There was a time when I sat there, and then I was the interviewer trying to look at, telling you to silence your phones. And so it's fun to be on this side. But I got to do with George Saunders, and after Lincoln and the Bardo, amazing book. And we got in a discussion where I asked him, I said, if you could take a pill and live 800 years, would you take it? And then, of course, he had all caveats. Well, what kind of life would I be able to have? What's the condition? Like, those are all the critical, relevant things. And he said, do I have to live with all my regrets for 800 years? Like, do I get some psychotherapy to go along with this? And I think we have this dream about maximum life expectancy, but I really think it's about, we know how to live 90, maybe 100 years. It will not surprise me if we're at we already have Japan and Korea that have an average 85-year life expectancy. Their top 1% are making it well past 90. I will not be surprised if 25 years from now we have countries with a 90 to 95-year life expectancy, but I would be surprised about the 125, 130-year max.
Okay, let's do a little interlude, and I'm going to borrow a game from Tyler Cowen called Overrated or Underrated, where basically I yell out various health trends, and you tell me if they're overrated or underrated.
So I got to do a twist then.
What's that?
You have to tell me what your rating is.
Okay, all right. I'll go after you go. All right. So is this undervalued or overvalued currently? The effect of GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic and Mounjaro on human health and lifespan?
Underrated.
Tell us why.
First, you.
I think I would say underrated.
Come on.
Underrated as well. Underrated. It's overrated.
No qualifications. This is underrated, overrated.
All right, I'll go appropriately rated. Appropriately rated.
You can't. You don't get to. This is your game. You don't get to play that game.
All right. Underrated.
All right. Underrated. So I think it's underrated.
Okay.
These GLP-1 drugs have proved to have substantial mortality reductions, are turning out to have some, the ways in which it plays with your desire for certain kinds of foods and other things, but also it potentially has use in addiction. There's a range of applications that it's under evaluation for right now. I don't want to promise that it's perfect for addiction at this point, but every trial has had massive levels of risk reduction, and it's changing our obesity profile. It's changing mortality rates for people at high risk. I do worry that it's attempting to medicate for some problems, which are, like, if you had a pill to stop the worst of smoking, would you still smoke? And there are aspects about the way we live that I think are still ones we need to address, and that you can't just Ozempic your way out of. But I think really underrated.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think
then why didn't you say that?
People generally get, I think, a little bit caught up in the cultural notions of what does this do to body image, which is an important thing. What does it do to specifically obesity? But every trial, it's just shocking, the results on reduction in cardiovascular risk, reversal of fatty liver disease, slowing the progression of chronic kidney disease, reducing stroke risk. And so I think from that perspective, from the chronic disease, preventive health perspective, they probably are underrated in that domain.
Yeah, and I still struggle with if we just could make sure we could let people sleep more for 8 hours or so a night, that would have as big effects on health in many ways. And so you can't just Ozempic your way out of it, I don't think.
All right, overrated or underrated, the effect of artificial intelligence on healthcare?
Overrated.
Agree.
All right. So right now I have 3 teams where we're trying to apply artificial intelligence to the work we're doing at USAID. first around just like basic, like let's just do some basic stuff, some basic burden reduction. Our teams will spend weeks pulling in data from the UN and the WHO on, say, life expectancy and things like that, and our HIV results and so on, and thought, okay, let's use artificial intelligence to make that job easier. It can translate into 250 languages. Let's translate our materials, and that'll be beneficial. And let's also, we have to fill out a lot of forms. Let's have it do the first draft of a lot of our forms. Two things. Number one, it's become super clear to me, this is at best a partner that makes a physician or a data analyst or a nurse, it can lift you to have more expert capability, but you have to police it like a hawk, and you got to know when it's lying. And it lies all the frickin' time. Like, we pull in the data sets, and they'll be missing data elements, and you want it to clean the data sets, and it'll insert new data elements in. Like, you've got to figure out how to instruct it not to make up fake data to go in. And the fake data is really convincing, like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'd put that data in there. But you can't completely just rely on it. And so the notion is just going to replace, there will be components of life where it'll replace folks, but, and I think that we have to navigate that. So, but the impact on medicine where we are not just like diagnosis and write a prescription machines. The relationship we have is to help you figure out your goals, understand how to optimize what's available in your community to actually reach that capability, and then help you implement and deliver that. And so I think it will only have a nudge. And I'm finding in every one of these simple cases, like translate materials and so on, we're having to write new GPTs or RAG models in order to make the thing work without just making bad mistakes.
Yeah, I think there are domains in which it's going to make huge impact. I think drug development and pharmaceutical innovation, I think it could really accelerate. But to our discussion earlier, I think so much of health is around behavior change and distribution of resources, and artificial intelligence, I don't think, is going to change a lot of those issues. And so from that perspective, I think it's overrated.
Do you use an AI scribe?
That's where all this come from. This is, no, I didn't think of any of this stuff. I don't use AI scribe because of that reason. Basically, is that a lot of it I find so far is it's not very helpful. All right, overrated or underrated? We'll do one more, or maybe a couple more, but I'm not going to answer the rest of these. CRISPR, gene therapy, gene editing.
I so want that to be underrated, but it's overrated. I think we're not there yet. Like a friend of mine, came up with CRISPR diagnostics that could do a like you could have a diagnostic at home that if you have a cold, you could, spit on a bit of filter paper and a CRISPR diagnostic would tell you what you have, and it might cost under $1. And he's shown it in a lab, but getting it to production, getting it to where it's going, it's still, so it's gonna, I think it is another vehicle that can change the world. But all of the implementation, production capabilities have really hit a wall. And when, I keep thinking, okay, on the next outbreak, we're really going to use CRISPR diagnostics. We're going to use it in XYZ. We really did be able to bring it into the home, into low-income communities, and I just feel we're a long way away from that.
Okay. All right, last one. Psychedelic therapy for mental health conditions.
You have to answer this one. Overrated.
I think overrated as well. Yeah, I think overrated as well. I think it's something that people would love to be totally transformational and may be helpful in some.
There are some trials, and I think that the evidence that it's often done by very, it's motivated, that it's biased trials, and that they have not been able to consistently replicate with enough fidelity to make me think it's going to be as transformative as people hope. And we're seeing some really bad downsides.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sure this is on no one's mind right now, but there is a presidential election next week. And for the first time in a generation, it feels like healthcare is not a central issue. There's not Medicare for all. There's not Obamacare repeal in any serious way. Thank God there's not, a raging pandemic. But if you think back from the time of Bill Clinton, obviously, some type of major healthcare transformation was always kind of a part of the campaign. And it seems like less so this time around. But of course, healthcare in various ways is always on the ballot. I mean, reproductive rights is an obvious example. But more generally, what would you say in terms of what difference would we see in healthcare, in the healthcare landscape in the U.S. under Trump versus a Harris administration?
Well, I'm a public official now, and I'm under the Hatch Act, which says I can't answer half of that question there.
That's what happens when you use ChatGPT to write these questions.
So in this role, I can't, officially being here today, or can't speak to my personal opinions about some of those subjects. But I will say, I think health is very much on the agenda with the reproductive health issue being front and center. I also think it's significant that basically we've all agreed universal health care is now not something that can be removed, and we've seen many, many more states now accepting the Affordable Care Act and expansion of Medicaid, and in a bipartisan way, recognition that pulling away the coverage is not a winner. There's still various, it is not a universal case, let's just say, that everybody is aligned on this here. The thing that strikes me around the world is that health is not actually that much of a driver of an issue. In places that have major shortfalls in people's survival, you would think that, throw them out. How can we be a place where 60% of people die before the age of 50 and not have brought that capability to the world and not hold accountable? But again and again, the fears of what might be the consequences of the taxes required to make it possible, or the changes in behavior required to make it possible, or the changes in the winners and losers by getting strong primary health care into place. That backlash that we saw with getting a universal health care aspiring plan, and at any rate, it took 75, 80 years for the U.S. to get to the point of the Affordable Care Act. The pattern is it's really hard to get in, but once you have it get in, people defend it tooth and nail, and so that is where it ends up on the ballot typically, is the threat of taking away the gains that have been made, but rarely is it that you really have the battles hinging on whether you're going to add better coverage or better quality care.
Usually moderators don't ask people to take out their phones, but if you do have a question, feel free to text it in, and we'll try to get to it in the last 10 minutes or so. I want to ask you about
phone numbers there.
Yeah, I want to ask you about trust, and so much of what we do in healthcare rests on having the trust of people, and of course, trust in recent decades in every institution has cratered, and during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's pretty depressing research that suggests in doctors, hospitals, public health agencies, across every socio-demographic group, trust has declined. And so I guess first, how big of an issue is that in your work or in the work that other healthcare professionals do, and what, if anything, can we do to start to rebuild trust?
It's huge, because health doesn't happen without trust. And but I'd also say, so people are lonely, they are disconnected, they have fewer avenues for a sense of belonging. And I think people in health, and I'd also put people in education, play a really special, important role, because we are, teachers and clinicians are the few that reach across the economic divides, across the political divides, across the race and ethnic divides, and have to be in touch with people face to face. And people in health and people in education are the glue. And I think we owe it to the country to do what we can to lead to strengthen those connections and to keep emphasizing, you know, at the core of what we do in health is the idea that all lives are of equal worth, which goes to me back to the founding documents of the country that all people are created equal. And what that means is that we are ashamed if we should be ashamed, and in general, we try to apologize for it if the CEO and the rich are the ones who get to the front of the line in healthcare, right? It's troubling about concierge medicine that you pay your way to get that life-saving relationship with a primary healthcare physician, and that the wealthy people have realized more and more that having that strong, connected relationship makes a big difference, and we are appropriately embarrassed about that, right? And I think we have an important role, all of us in health, to recognize we are among those that every day are making contact on a person-to-person level and have that capacity, and that it's really important that we keep that ability to keep working across the boundaries, because that has given us trust. As weakened as all trust is, people in health, people in education, teachers, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and so on, people who you contact are the people who retain the trust in society, and I think we have to keep building on that.
Yeah. Related, I want to ask you about taking risks in medicine and taking risks with medical research. And I remember an article that you once read that basically argued that some of the innovations that we have today wouldn't have been possible if there weren't kind of loony doctors back in the day that were trying all sorts of crazy things. And we don't allow a lot of that for good reason today. But are we too cautious as an institution, or are we appropriately cautious? Overrated or underrated?
So caution is underrated. The article you're referring to was one I wrote about a surgeon who was the chair of surgery at my hospital, at the Brigham Women's Hospital that I used to belong to. His name was Randy Moore. And he led a group of people who made discovery after discovery after discovery, including, for example, they did the first kidney transplant. They brought the first ventilators into practice. They did all kinds of extraordinary things in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And what struck me about the kidney transplant case was they had 30 straight deaths, and it was the 31 that became successful. And one colleague, a friend of mine who would become the CEO of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, David Nathan, was a chief resident on the medical team at the time, and he said, this is homicide. When he was seeing one death after another death after another death, this is homicide. And that tension was incredibly important. It was the case that you had to have that learning through failure. You have to have that learning through failure. But you also have to have the transparency that this is what is happening. And there are lots of ways in which our regime of having proper consent has become an overly bureaucratic, paperwork-driven process rather than actually making sure that people have consent. But we've been able to build an edifice where there's more and more chance for participation in that process. There's more and more chance to be parts of trials. It's a routine, common American experience that, if you are facing a life-threatening illness, a cancer, and so on, that there's a high chance you might be offered a chance. If there's not a solution, that you might be offered a chance to be in a trial. And our ability to have trust in those has evolved so that we have tens of thousands of trials now going on regularly. We are willing to fail and work our way through that while protecting against the worst kinds of exploitation that we saw in Tuskegee and other places, and saw things that would make us cringe today about the ways that we went about some of those discoveries in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, also that time was, doing frontal lobectomies as the other thing we threw into the world for a good 20 years.
Well, we have some great questions from the audience. I feel like I should have crowdsourced my questions now. But let me ask you a couple that we have here. One is around climate change and public health and the ways in which you see climate change influencing the work that you do today and how you think it's going to change the world specifically as it relates to health in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
So this one is underrated. Climate and health and the impact there is extraordinary. First of all, I'll start with a picture. In March, I was in India visiting some of our programs, and as part of that, my family's from India. My father's from a village in Maharashtra, and so I took a couple of extra days to go visit my family there. So it was March of this year, and in this farm belt area, the village my father's from, come from a family of farmers, and the temperature was 105 degrees in March. It would reach 115 to 120 degrees as a daily high in May. There never were temperatures like this when I used to visit at younger age. The result is the crops were not growing. The growing season and the amount of crop food output was down, which meant that their incomes were down, the debt levels were high. You also saw enormous amount of pollution. So India now has, 10 of the 15 most polluted cities in the world, a high number of the polluted cities. When you're in Delhi, you feel like you're smoking a pack a day. The haze is everywhere. I thought I would escape that in the rural area, and it was not the case because the areas around there have industrialized, and that haze and that smoke was there. Air pollution is now tied with smoking for the biggest killer in the world. It's a combination of outdoor, so out of 50 million people who die per year in the world, about 7 million die from indoor or outdoor air pollution and almost 8 million from smoking. And so addressing fossil fuel production of that pollution is a major opportunity for saving lives. It's cardiovascular, it's lung disease, and it's cancers. It's sort of across the board. But second, extreme heat compounded matters. So extreme heat, which we're now starting to see at an extraordinary level, we now have protocols because your electricity stops working above a certain level. The number of heat strokes start rising when you get temperatures this high. And then the third level is we have the distribution of infectious diseases changes, especially vector-borne diseases, mosquito-borne diseases. Like dengue is moving, we're seeing more dengue cases. These are diarrheal illnesses carried by bacteria. There's a new disease has made its way to the US border called Oropouche disease out of Brazil. It's a Zika-like disease and can cause, we're still trying to understand what causes it. We don't know the exact bug that carries it. We think it's a mosquito, but it might be a mite. And so we're seeing emergence and shift of whether it's malaria, other conditions that move around the world. So I think in the next 30 to 50 years, add on that all the climate catastrophes and the ways that not only lead to, we have family in Asheville, North Carolina, and all of the damage done there, 2.5 weeks to get electricity and water back, and they still don't have drinkable water. It is extraordinary, and the impact of climate catastrophes is massive on health systems, and people, don't get their care in those settings, and there's all kinds of excess death that we have not even begun to track. So I think it's massively underrated as an impact on our health and the function of our health systems.
Let's go with a mood shift.
Okay.
So what are you most optimistic about in the coming years as it relates to health and technology?
The reality is we have steadily, with the exception of during the pandemic, had 70 plus years of steady rise in our human life expectancy. And we have recovered all the losses since then as well. So what I'm optimistic about is that as complex as healthcare is, as politically challenging, it is our best demonstration that human cooperation not only can work, it is working. It is constantly happening, and that, that we don't actually live in a state of chaos and the nasty, brutish, and short world of this supposed state of nature. And we have capabilities that are at our fingertips that can help us live longer, healthy lives. We are beneficiaries of it, and there is still much more gain. If we have an average life expectancy of 78 years, a healthy life expectancy of 70 years, we have an average capacity to get already in today's world a 90-year average life expectancy.
We have a couple questions about kind of the corporatization of medicine, and I think people probably recognize that the days of Marcus Welby and doctors making house calls are long gone. But I think most people do see medicine as a profession and not a business. But increasingly, private equity is acquiring medical practices and hospitals. Insurers are acquiring these entities as well. And so, are you concerned about greater corporate activity in the healthcare sector?
Absolutely. The larger picture to me is we saw healthcare as a craft, an individual's craft. It is that capability to deploy those 19,000 medical drugs, those 4,000 medical and surgical procedures, to do it the right way, the right time, is a team sport. And it takes organizations. Having that arose at the same time that we had the development of health institutions as a major part of every person's life. You carry with you a connection to a health institution lifelong now, so that we're not people who only live to our mid-40s, but into our 80s and beyond. And we have not figured out how to make those institutions work. We know the challenges of making them all government institutions. You can get equity, but little innovation, often not as much dynamism. You get more fairness, but less efficiency, less speed, less opportunity to have the pieces advance. We know in nonprofit models that those are the biggest health systems we've really built around the country, are largely nonprofit models, that they have great beneficial aspects, but they behave more and more like corporate institutions, and the blurring between the nonprofit and for-profit is there. And then the for-profit world you get scale. Throughout the South, much of the hospital base that the Hospital South didn't have has been built by for-profit corporations because the public institutions weren't being built. And none of them do we feel very good about. And I think that, to me, is, I said I was fascinated and driven by this human story of how we all get to live this long and why we fail at it. This is this generational challenge that I'm totally fascinated by and excited by, our ability to make these large organizations work for the benefit of all.
We have a question about health literacy and how important that is to people being able to move through the world and make healthy choices for themselves. And on the one hand, there's many more ways in which you can get information, and much of that information is not high-quality information. There's a lot of misinformation, increasingly disinformation. So maybe you could talk for a moment about just the information ecosystem and how people should start to parse good information, bad information, and how do we tackle this problem of information that is not accurate?
Well, in general, I have not felt threatened or beaten down by the amount of misinformation. It is painful and difficult, and yet, I had to stop my surgical practice in order to take this job, and that was a hard thing to do because I got to see what the world was coming in my door every day. And people, came in having little information when I started my training to now coming in with a lot of information typically available to them, sometimes printed out on lots of sheets of paper, sometimes with trials like, what about this or that? And, it's easy to be a little bit annoyed by some of those queries. But the reality of how much better prepared people are coming in, how much more they know, and how much transparency and what they expect has increased. And I think that's part of the contribution to why we have steadily had, not just here, but around the world, better outcomes along the way. My father came from that village in Maharashtra, and when he went to medical school, it was 200 kilometers from where we live, and the only information he had about how his mother died of malaria, he watched her die when he was 10 years old, and the information was out there to save her life and the medicines, but it just never got to them. And when he then went to his medical school, he was the country boy in the big city, and he would bring relatives to stay in his dorm room with him because this was a place that had information that they couldn't have. And he became the only source and font of information. That's the world that we had, where experts were revered and, treated with great honor, which is a wonderful thing, but did not make everybody better. And so in this world where it's a little crazier, and we're constantly dealing with, the cousin who insists that you really ought to listen to well, I won't even make a political joke. Just we have that. We all live now with everybody being an expert epidemiologist. Surgeons are running public health institutions. The reality of it has been a net plus, and we need ways to have more trusted information, and it doesn't help that some of those sources have gone in the wrong direction, like Twitter. But I think we're beneficiaries in the long run.
If you could do one thing to improve health equity in the United States, what would it be?
Well, understand, I said our top 1% live 89 years or so. That was pre-pandemic. An economist named Raj Chetty sort of really crunched the numbers and got income tax return data and put it all together. And what's shocking is that the bottom 1% only lived 72 years. And then in COVID, that dropped for the Native American population to 65 years. It's like the entire gains of half a century of discovery were wiped away. The things that you see in the countries that are able to make progress that reduce the inequalities is how they get to match and exceed U.S. life expectancy. And again, it's around making basic things like primary health care, your essential medicines that help you live a long life, minimal cost and freely accessible as much as possible with decent quality. Now, making that happen is not easy, but you've seen countries do it. Costa Rica and Chile now have the two highest life expectancies in North and South America with a fraction of the spending that we have. They've matched Canada. Thailand, which we helped support as they developed their health system, went from 35% of deaths happening before the age of 50 to now matching U.S. overall life expectancy in the space of 20 years by building that primary healthcare structure, including community health volunteers who will knock on doors in their neighborhood and check to see have people had their blood pressure measured. Do you want to have it measured? I'll take it for you. Have your height and weight of your child measured and catch malnutrition, catch people who have unrecognized illnesses, and the benefits. So if you're in the top half of income and have a cancer, you want to be here. But if you're in the bottom half of income and need those basic life-saving things in primary health care, they've created that and got it there.
I think we have time for one last question. This is kind of it's not an asking for a friend type question, but if there are younger people in the audience who want to do something in healthcare, in public health, more generally to make the world a better place, what piece of advice would you give them?
I haven't met a young person who is not trying to figure out how they get a place in the world to make a difference and do meaningful work. And the best advice I ever got was a colleague who said, say yes to everything before you're 40 and no to everything after you're 40. And what they meant was, before you're 40, try lots of stuff. And don't be afraid, and then pay attention to what actually energizes you and you're good at. Along the way, you know, I was headed to focusing on surgery. I was energized by that. But I had a lot of friends who were writers, and I loved the idea of potentially trying to write. And one friend started an internet magazine and said, hey, will you write a piece for it? And I found myself making time at 10 o'clock at night, you know, to write in the middle of surgical training, and that told me something. I got energy from it, and paying attention to that and putting it together. You know, in the end, it was a combination of surgery. I was willing to do that, writing and public health. Had no idea how to put it together, and then eventually it does. And you know, the internet didn't exist when I started when I was an undergrad. So where we will be depends much more on your gravitating to what you're good at, figuring that out, and then by the time you're 40, you should kind of know it and just tell everybody else to go away, and do, you know, your advantage over 40 is you can make a bet for 10 years or 20 years of your life, and know you have things that you will follow through on, and that's will be how you give back.
Well, thank you, Atul, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you all for joining us. And from all of us here at The New Yorker, we hope that you have a wonderful day.